Dies the Fire, the first book in S.M. Stirling's long-running Emberverse series, was published 20 years ago. I didn't read it at the time. Several people recommended it to me over the years, and I still didn't read it. When I finally picked it up during the great autoimmune response of 2020, I appreciated it all the more because at that time I was living in Western Oregon, where the book is set. Apocalypse stories are doubly cool when you regularly move through all the locations. Insert obligatory Portland jab here. The story is a spin-off of an earlier Stirling series, and it begins in 1998. Everything is going along on its late 90s way when suddenly there's a blinding flash everywhere, worldwide, and then nothing works anymore. Well, specifically, electricity and compression work differently, rendering modern technology inoperable. Gasoline and gunpowder will burn, but they won't explode, so no vehicles and no guns. A whole lot of people die within minutes as hospitals shut down, planes fall out of the sky without engines or electric controls, and mayhem ensues. The book follows several groups of survivors and the powerful effect their personalities have on the societies that form around them. Mike Havel, a pilot flying a wealthy family to their ranch in Montana, manages to bring his dead Cessna down in the forests of Idaho, where they fight those three white supremacists mainstream media is always on about, and they, along with some folks they rescue, become the core of a group that comes to be known as the Bear Killers. Juniper, a Wiccan hippie, gathers a group that becomes the Mackenzies, a tribe of pseudo-Celtic woo-woo types. And of course, Norman Arminger, a history professor and SCA enthusiast who forms the Portland Protective Association and rebrands himself as the Lord Protector, adopting the Eye of Sauron as his sigil in the process. He is the first to really recognize the implications of what's happened. While most people are running around in a panic or looting, he's thinking more long-term. Everything that's been invented in the last 800 years is useless now. There's only two ways to live in a time like this: farming and living off farmers. I don't feel like pushing a plow. Arminger understands that not only has modern technology failed, but that the social property relations dependent on that technology no longer apply. And he's uniquely positioned to exploit it by having both the academic background to see the macro-level impact and the practical combat skill to be badass in a world where swordsmanship is suddenly relevant again. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about that. I've seen some SCA fights, and I've had some training in swordsmanship way back, mostly Iaido, Iaijutsu, but a little bit of broadsword. I am a terrible swordsman. I expect that Arminger is not a whole lot better when the change hits. But 99% of people in the developed world have no practical experience with a sword, or a spear, or any other edged weapon. Hand most people a sword to fight with, and they'll either try to hack with it like a machete, or they'll swing it like a baseball bat. Either of those is a good way to get dead if tried against someone that knows how to fight with a blade. The idea that the professor and his SCA chapter could act while everyone is still confused and get street gangs on their side isn't as far-fetched as it might seem at first. When all forms of modern weapons cease to function, a dozen armored reenactors with broadswords fighting as a unit suddenly become much more formidable in comparison with everybody else they meet. They secure the food supply and establish a brutal form of law and order which draws people to them. We have to understand how desperate people get in this situation. Your average city dweller has a few days of food at home and no idea how to farm, hunt, or forage. More importantly, even if every resident of Portland was Daniel Boone, that kind of population density is dependent on technology and importing food. So while some people are deemed to have useful skills or controllable thuggishness and are brought on as a new nobility, a lot of them accept a crude form of serfdom in exchange for protection from murder and starvation. Of course, that kind of desperation doesn't last, but by then they have slave collars clamped on, Caesar's Legion style, and they can't very well just cut it off with a Dremel. Arminger deliberately creates a near-instant feudal-esque LARP society with an aristocracy headed by himself. Some people submit out of fear and desperation. A steady supply of gruel and bread in exchange for a lifetime of manual labor appeals to them when they're faced with starvation. Others submit to his authority out of a desire for personal gain. When technology fails, the SCA and HEMA chapters with their own swords, armor, and skill in using them become the toughest gang on the streets, and working for them seems like a better path to wealth and comfort than trying to go it alone. And because they're approaching it as a return to the feudal era, that shapes the society they build. They benefit by having a model to follow, but it bakes in some assumptions. Arminger makes the mistake of assuming that because the technological and therefore socioeconomic conditions of the New World are equivalent to medieval Europe, that the psychological conditions are also equivalent. He forgets that he's not dealing with medieval peasants. He's dealing with late 20th century survivors of a technological collapse forced to live like medieval peasants. And consequently, he fails to consider that his enemies aren't as locked into that model as he is. We could probably make an argument that this is a parable of extreme conservatism leading to brittle societies that can't innovate. But it doesn't quite hold up. The Protectorate does move beyond the medieval template. For example, later in the series they use railroad tracks for transit and fireball-flinging armored ships on the Columbia River, not to mention heavy use of concrete in construction. But not before losing a fortress to Mike Havel and the Bear Killers, operating essentially as a private military company at this point, who use hang gliders for a Dark Age airborne assault. But in the days and weeks following the change, a lot of people have their own visions of the new world taking shape around them. While Arminger goes full medieval times, others cling to different visions, to their own pseudo-mythologies that are suddenly competing on even terms. The Mackenzies build themselves up as a sort of Wiccan farming community, drawing on Juniper's fuzzy-wuzzy worldview, but the harsh conditions of the New World stiffen their resolve when a group of officials from Salem, formerly the state capital and now just a hotbed of troublesome busybodies, but I repeat myself, arrive to collect a quota of foodstuffs. The mousy-looking woman shouted into the quiet, "How can you be so selfish? Half the people in Portland are sitting in camps around Salem and Albany now. Gangsters have taken over Portland and driven them out. People are dying of hunger and disease. Little children are starving to death." "No, we will not give you our food. Not because we grudge help, but because we have little ones of our own to think of. If we gave you all that we have, you'd be starving again in a week, and so would we." While Arminger and Juniper both serve as the focal point for their tribes, the Bear Killers begin with a more composite influence. Mike Havel, pilot, woodsman, veteran, starts the cataclysm better equipped than most to survive. With him in the plane he manages to glide down into the Idaho forest is Ken Larson, an engineer, and his 3 kids, Eric, Astrid, and Signe. Mom's there too, but she doesn't really have much of a role in this. Astrid, the younger of the 2 daughters, is both an archery enthusiast and a huge Tolkien nerd. You're beginning to see glimmers of the society that forms around them. It's Astrid that makes a bearskin cloak for Mike out of the black bear they kill. The getup is complete with a bear's head helmet. She illustrates a chronicle of their early days, suitably embellished with the orcish thugs that kidnap the women early on being depicted as actual knuckle-dragging green-skinned orcs, and by the first generation born post-change, they've evolved a sort of fantasy Viking culture. For the founding generation, for those that create the culture, it's a combination of improvisation for survival reasons and trauma-fueled eccentricity. But as soon as a new generation is born into it, whether Arminger's faux feudalism or the Mackenzies' Wiccan commune, they become real living cultures, every bit as valid as those in our own world. And the entire series is defined by this founder effect, with communities accreting around leaders that set the parameters for the culture and the community going forward. Arminger goes whole hog into the medieval thing, with period costumes and titles, living out the fantasy at the expense of the sorry bastards that end up on the bottom of their new hierarchy, and all according to a plan for social and economic organization. The others are much less deliberate in the society they create, but just as influential on the generations that follow. To a point, because while cultures are just collections of stories and generational habits, they only endure if they work in real-world conditions. They don't have to be optimized, they don't even have to work particularly well, but they do have to help people deal with the world, and they have to be self-reinforcing to some extent. Religion is often a component of this, which Arminger tries to do with the creation of the Orthodox Catholic Church. The Mackenzies are more successful in that respect because their approach was more organic, letting the religion spread through social interaction rather than being imposed like Arminger's state religion. But the same rules apply to the economic facets of a society. First, it has to work. If people are hungry, they get surly and hierarchies tend to break down. It's results that matter. But it also has to be self-reinforcing. The feudalism of medieval Europe was held together by mutual social and economic dependency far more than by brute force. But under Arminger's Portland Protective Association, the serfs are treated more like slaves, and they know they can join the Mackenzies if they get the chance to run away. Instead of working the land because they're tied to it by tradition, loyalty, and family, they have to be chained to it by the neck and watched so they don't run off. Arminger doesn't take into account that his pseudo-feudalism has competition. The world didn't go backward, it just broke, and the pieces can be arranged in many different ways. Arminger's vision appeals to those who become barons, but most people have better prospects elsewhere, forcing the PPA to bake in a level of authoritarianism that is expensive and difficult to maintain. It's hard enough to guard your border to make sure armies don't get in. Add in your own people trying to get out, and suddenly you have a lot of your trained fighting men standing around, sucking up pay and provisions, doing nothing but watching both sides of a wall. It's a lot more cost-effective if your population wants to be there. I have often heard it said that Stirling loosely based Norman Arminger on Harry Turtledove, another author who's written some books I thoroughly enjoyed. Guns of the South, the World War series, some of the Southern Victory books. While I don't know how true that is, I find the idea interesting because there are several Turtledove books that, for me, were too directly taken from real history, too much one-for-one equivalency. And that's where Arminger falls short. Too much reliance on the historical rhyme when the underlying conditions aren't really the same. Seriously, I like Turtledove. That's not intended as a diss at all. At the end of the first Emberverse trilogy, Arminger and his Portland Protective Association are defeated in a war against pretty much everyone else in the Pacific Northwest. They aren't completely destroyed. In a way, they're forced to become closer to what Arminger was basing his ideas on, a feudal society rather than a slave economy run by thugs. But they lost because they'd spent years building animosity and resistance through constant efforts to impose their vision of the world onto everyone else. Consider how it might have played differently if instead of enslaving desperate people at sword point, they'd organized them into work crews in exchange for food and protection directed by the few people that actually know how to farm, who could be granted land and titles. As the displaced rabble gradually become competent farmers, grant them small fiefs, either directly or through the first batch of nobles. The crop yield would be comparable. Farming isn't simply a matter of throwing more labor at it. You can't farm in shifts to increase output from the same land. But there would also be loyalty and a sense of almost patriotism toward the new feudal state they were building. Obviously, that doesn't make for as good a story. Dark Lords are way more epic than competent administrators. But it is something to consider that for all his medieval pretensions, Arminger fell into the trap of 20th century dictators, trying to build an empire as quickly as possible on the backs of slaves worked almost as industrial machinery and disregarding how resource intensive it is and how much opposition it creates. On top of that, Arminger didn't realize how much of the world he was trying to build was just self-edifying, how he was deep down just a D&D kid trying to live as a character. He missed important details not only of the new world around him, but in himself. Perhaps it's a lesson to be taken from the books. That, and don't take chances with cannibals, just put them right down. Why it took me so long to finally get to an Emberverse book, I don't know.